Welcome to Speedrunner Reviews. In this series I'll be analysing and reviewing games using the mindset of speedrunning. This video will look at the game from three perspectives. First, the casual experience, which is how most people will first play the game. Next, we'll discuss the speedrun experience, including all the interesting tech and how well the game holds up as a speed game. Finally, we'll look at the tool-assisted speedrun, showing what the game looks like when pushed to the theoretical limit. If you already know the game and want to jump straight to the speedrun part, I've left timestamps in the description and chapters. Today we're looking at Ys for the Master System, sometimes pronounced Ys, sometimes pronounced Ys, but it's spelled YS. And this is the first game in the series, originally released on the PC 88 but then ported to the Master System, which is the version we'll look at today. If you end up enjoying this video, then please consider subscribing to keep up to date. I'm hoping to continue making these kinds of videos, and subscriptions help out the channel a bunch. So let's talk about what kind of game this is. This at heart is an action RPG. It's got this cool bonk mechanic rather than normal attacks, so when you're killing enemies you don't press a button to attack or anything, you just sort of run into them. And there's a bit of a trade-off, so if you hit them from the back you're usually going to come out better, if you hit them from the side you're going to win, but if you hit them head on it's a bit of luck. Sometimes you hit them, sometimes you don't, more often than not they hit you. So there's a lot of strategy in ducking and weaving around enemies, trying to get towards their side or their back and do lots of damage. This footage here shows some early parts of the game and you can see that we're pretty weak against the enemies. It takes us lots of hits to actually kill them, and if they hit us we're pretty much dead straight away. So there is a strategy where you can heal yourself up. You can sort of just stay still here and you'll gradually heal up, but of course if you're doing a speedrun or trying to go fast or anything, that takes a lot of time to heal up. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And it's an old RPG for its time, and fitting with that theme, there is a lot of grinding. Pretty much if you play this game, you'll be sitting in this section here, grinding out for a couple of hours probably, before you're actually ready to go in and play the game. That's going to put a lot of people off starting at first, but if you make it through this grinding section, you're in for a really good experience overall. Just to give you scope for how long this sort of takes, to beat the first boss you need at least 800 experience points. If you have any less than that, you'll be at such a low level that you won't be able to damage it. These little red men enemies are giving us 2 experience points, and the dog enemies are giving us 3 experience points every time we kill one. So it is going to take you a little while to get started on this game. But it's a good opportunity to sort of get used to the controls and everything and used to the bonk mechanic before you're into somewhere where it really matters. The really cool thing about the Ys series in general is that it lets you save anywhere. So if I wanted to right now, I could just pull up the pause menu and save exactly where I am, almost like a save state in a sense. So when you finish your game, you're basically going to have played it as if you were playing a Taz. You save before the difficult enemies and you try them, and if you don't beat them, you just try it again. So it's really cool because they can make the game extremely difficult because of that, since you can pretty much die anyway, you just have to save before you come into any enemy encounter. Although the grind at the start is ridiculously long, there are some things that you can do to speed it up, like this hidden gold pedestal in the lake for whatever reason. You can sell this for 2,000 gold, and that can be used to buy various swords, shields and armors throughout the town. Also, if you know what you're doing, you can make an extra $500 right at the start of the game. You literally just buy this sapphire ring from the shop here and you sell it to somebody else in the bar. You buy it for 1,000 gold, you sell it for 1,500, so you end up turning a profit. And the other fun part about that is it gives you some experience points too for doing it. I don't know why that happens, but it is really helpful. If you do that, you're going to get 150 experience points, which puts you well on your way to getting the 800 you need. But once you got your sword armor and shield and everything and gained a few experience points, you can actually get in and experience the game itself. So pretty much as soon as you beat this first boss in the temple, the game opens wide up. You're going to get a key to open treasure chests, which means you can explore pretty much any way you want to. It's not a huge game, there are only 3 dungeons, so sort of the 2 dungeons and then the final tower, but it is really enjoyable. So one highlight for this series for me absolutely is the music. Every game in this series has awesome music, and I'll be playing a whole bunch in the background of this video. That just keeps you going through some of the longer grinds and keeps you entertained. It's also got really nice graphics and scrolling and everything for the time as well. It's pretty impressive. So this game came out in 1987 and it's still enjoyable and holds up pretty well today. Especially the later ones in the series where they expand out a bit and try a few different things, like Ys 3 where it's a side scroller of all things. There's lots of variety in the series to get used to. The core gameplay loop is just a whole bunch of grinding and enemy killing and stuff, but it's sort of mindless and you get into a nice little zone and rhythm with it. While you're jamming with the music, you can just kill enemies and just spend a few hours grinding through, not really thinking too much, but having a really good time. You will know if you've gone ahead too quickly, because here for example you can't even damage this enemy yet at the current level. So if that ever happens, you just need to go back and grind a little bit more for it. That sort of lack of damaging stops you from ploughing too far ahead. Since you can just save the game wherever you want, you can in theory get yourself into some pretty rough situations, but usually this sort of mechanic stops you. You know that you're running into a bad situation when you actually can't damage the enemies in that area. One thing that I really like about this game is the simplicity. You just get experience and gold, that's pretty much it. And if you look at the equipping screen here, you'll see how simple it is. You can pull up sword, shields and armor and just literally scroll to the one you want. And the ones on the right are stronger, that's just how it works. So you can sort of see how much armor and stuff you're going to get throughout the game. It is not a big game at all. Along the game you collect the Books of Ys, and you can actually read them in the game. As far as I'm concerned, the game has some pretty deep lore, although I've never played many of the later games in the series, so I've never really got my head around it all. But there's lots to read here if you're interested in that kind of stuff. There's also this weird bit of lore where you talk to this tree and it like gives you a sword, but you have to find its other brother tree first. Yeah, it's pretty weird. This tree sword side quest is definitely worth doing though, because it's one of the best swords in the game that you get from it. You do have to go to the mine before you're able to do it though. Also, I don't know why, but the twins in town kind of creep me out. It kind of reminds me of The Shining or something. Now about half of the game are these first two dungeons, the Temple and the Mine, where you sort of grind up all your levels, and then you go to the Tower of Doomed at the end of the game, and this guy actually won't let you turn around. I think the reason for that is because in the original version of the game, this was on disc 2, and you couldn't reinsert disc 1 once you'd started that. But here on the Master System version, they still stop you from leaving the tower, and it's fair to say this tower is absolutely huge and very, very cryptic. It's also kind of weird because they force you to be maximum level before you come into this tower. The boss that you have to beat before you get in, you need to be max level to deal any damage at all to. So there's not really any point killing enemies in this tower either, although the enemies are pretty tricky. Now just a heads up that in talking about this final section of the game, I will be giving some spoilers, just in case you don't want to see how to get through this tower. Now of course it wouldn't be a game from the 80s without being incredibly cryptic. This tower is big, and it's a maze. Just to get your head around it, here's a scope of what the map actually looks like. If you know what you're doing in a playthrough of Ys, this tower is going to be about half of your entire playthrough. It doesn't take you that long to actually walk through the whole thing, but what takes you long is the amount of backtracking needed, because there are several points in this tower where you have to pretty much walk back to almost the start of it just to see various characters. Not to mention, every time you go to a new room in the tower, you have to go through this big room transition screen that has all the pillars on it. So pretty much you have to walk past 8 of these pillars incredibly slowly to get through to the next screen. So you really want to be sure about where you're going before you commit to going to a new room. You might kill like 30 or 40 seconds going back and forth each time. Unfortunately, this is one of the parts where Ys hasn't aged particularly well. One improvement I would love to see for the Master System version would be a movement speed increase, but also a difference in how close you can get to the screen before the screen scrolls. You can see that you actually get pretty close to the edge there, and it can make it tricky when enemies just pop up by surprise. So one example of the cryptic bit of the tower is having to use the Mask of Eyes. This is an item that you got way back in the temple, but you use it to sort of see secret passages. Now you might think you just leave it on and deal with playing the game in black and white, although when you've got the Mask of Eyes on, the enemies don't show up, so you can just get hit randomly by things that you can't even see. You sort of just have to know the secret passages here because you do have to talk to this person in it. There's another really cryptic bit of this game that involves a poison room. So there's a room that normally kills you if you walk into it. To stop the room being poisonous, you have to hammer one of the poles in this section. So it's the 5th pole on this screen. But at this point you may have passed like 200 or 300 poles so far. There's no indication you actually have to hammer this one. And not only that, but you have to hammer it from the front. If you know what pole it is and you hammer it from the back, it just doesn't work either. So that's really cryptic, and I honestly don't know how you would have done that back in the 80s without a guide or something like that. Definitely worth having a walkthrough if you're playing this game. There's also this mirror maze section, which is incredibly easy to get lost in. The mirrors just warp you all around the place, and they have the classic trope of like, you go through one mirror and then if you go back through the same mirror, you go to a different spot. It's kind of weird. So for example here, you'll see I go into the right mirror there, but if I go back into the mirror that I came from, that's actually how you beat the maze. Not sure how many people would actually think to do that, unless they were really stumped at just banging their head against the wall with this. There's also this strange bit of the dungeon that has this locked door with no indication of how to open it. You have to put on the evil ring, which is an item that essentially lets you open that door. The only thing about the evil ring is normally when you put that item on, the character just dies, like you lose health and you can't take the ring off and you're dead. So you sort of have to wear the evil ring and the necklace to protect you, and if you wear both those things then you can enter the door and talk to this person. No, you actually do have to talk to this person to beat the game. Once you make it through all the cryptic parts, you get towards the final boss. I actually find this section really cool. It's got this boss with two faces, and only one of the faces is vulnerable at a time, but every time you hit it, it swaps. Pretty cool design for a boss here, and it lets you use some strategies like when they overlap, you can get a whole bunch of hits in. Speaking of cool bosses, the final boss has a really neat gimmick where it takes away the floor as you're trying to kill it. So you have to be strategic about where you actually hit the final boss, because if you hit it in the wrong spots, you might put yourself into a corner with floors that you can't cross. Pretty scary stuff. One little tip I will give you for the final boss is don't use the flame sword, even though that's the best sword in the game. It says it's more powerful, but the silver sword does more damage against the final boss, even though it's got a lower attack power. I don't know why. So although this game has a lot of cryptic stuff and a lot of grinding, if you play with the walkthrough you should be mostly fine, and I would really recommend it. It's a pretty good introduction to the series and still holds up fairly well, and some of the later games in the series are definitely worth playing. I have a real soft spot for Ys 3 for example, which is a side scroller, because there's a bit more nuance into how you kill enemies rather than just bonking into them. But the whole series is definitely worth playing, and I'd check this game out. Okay, so we're now going to look at the speedrun. The speedrun tends to go pretty quick with menuing and stuff, so I've slowed down the first bit of the run just to show you everything that's going on. First thing we're going to do is make a visit to the second-hand shop where we can sort of buy and sell items. We're going to buy a really important item called the mirror. Now the mirror lets you sort of kill enemies from a distance. It deals damage to them. Now we can only buy one mirror. I'll show you what happens if you try and buy more. The dude just sort of says that you can't buy anymore, so we just leave the shop now. And we've beaten the game. That's fantastic. So this is an example of a game end glitch. Ys has a really weird glitch where if you try and buy the mirror a few times in a row, various different weird things can happen. One of those things could be just jumping straight to the credits. Now if you look at speedrun.com, you'll see this is an incredibly popular category and you can beat the game in about 20 seconds using this. Literally you do what I did. You just walk into the shop and buy the mirror 3 times and then you leave. The only thing that you have to do a little bit extra is the screen setup. So I'll jump back to the run that I showed you before and step it out. You'll see when I start the run there's some stuff that I brushed over, so you do have to walk down until you get the screen lined up to this setup. I like to use the third brick above that window there on the top building. Then you walk left, and I like to use the tree that pops up on screen as a reference. You just scroll a little bit past that tree. Then all you do need to do is go into the shop, you successfully buy a mirror once, and then you attempt to buy the mirror 3 times. If you do that, you should get a warp to the credits. I'll just note that this glitch does work a little bit differently on some flash carts and emulators, for example. So I was playing on real hardware here and I was able to warp to the credits, and I can usually replicate this on emulators and stuff like that. And if you do this, the credits actually play out pretty successfully. Like you get all the way to the end and see credits and everything. Credits music is always really awesome as well, so that's worth checking out. Now the cool thing about this glitch is that so many different things will happen if you come into the shop with slightly different setups. More often than not the game will just crash or reset or something like that, and here's a little example of what that could look like. I'm just buying the mirror way too many times and the game can't handle it. But you can also get some really useful stuff that isn't level warps. We have a little disco going on here, then we warp halfway across the game and level up about 7 times. Yeah, it's pretty weird. So that gave me 50,000 gold, which means I can buy pretty much anything I want in the game, and I'm also at a high enough level to beat the first boss now. This would be a really fun way to avoid some grinding at the start of the game, since the start of the game can be pretty slow. Now sometimes when you do this, you might not actually get an experience gain, but you might get something else. Like in this one, I warp to that same spot and gain a whole bunch of equipment. A lot of this equipment you actually can't get until a lot later in the game, so it's pretty cool that you can get it so early. And sometimes you can just completely mess up your game. I like to compare this area to Glitch City in Pokemon because it gives a similar vibe. Also, if you save here and load up again, you'll still just be in Glitch City, it doesn't restore it. So there's so many different things you can do with this glitch, and I would not be surprised if somebody finds a faster credits warp than what the current route does. It's definitely worth playing around with if you have access to this game, and lots of fun. Although I've shown a lot of cool effects here, I will show some other kooky effects at the end of the video, just in a little compilation. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the leaderboard is split up based on use of this mirror glitch. We have the any % category, which is no restriction, and then we have the no credits warp category. So this one's a bit weird. This one still uses the mirror glitch to get a whole bunch of experience and items and stuff, but it doesn't warp to the credits. So it sort of does the last tower normally, so to speak. Then you've literally got no mirror glitch. Now this last category is pretty much just glitchless. So that 145 is all the grinding, everything you need to do to beat the game, as intended. It is a very impressive run. So now we're going to look at the glitchless world record. This runner is very impressive. They've grinded out both the middle category and this long category, and they definitely deserve more subs. Currently they only have 2, so I'd encourage you to subscribe to them and check out this video as well. So the route starts out pretty normally. They just leave town and go up to get that gold pedestal. They get the pedestal up here, which they can then sell for 2,000 gold back in town. In the shops they equip themselves with the weakest sword, shield and armor. They could buy the middle sword, but they're going to be saving up money for the strongest sword. Also, it's important to equip with shield and armor so that you can actually get the crystal and actually unlock that first temple. So that's why they're equipping all 3 of those, even though they probably don't need so much defense at this point. They get the crystal, which also gives you a little experience point boost. Then they head over here and do the big grind. Essentially you can just keep killing these 2 enemies over and over again to get a whole bunch of gold and experience. It does take a while though. After about 9 minutes they go into the temple to grab the ruby mainly. They actually can't beat the boss yet because they're not at a high enough level, so they're going to leave the temple now with that ruby. The ruby you can essentially just sell for some more gold. Now that they're a higher level, they're going to kill enemies just outside this area here. Yeah, it's a pretty good grinding spot. The enemies give you 4 experience points rather than the previous ones, which give you 3 and 2. After a much longer section of grinding, they do make their way back to town and buy the better sword. So it's the towel, and it's the best sword that you can buy from the town, but it isn't the best sword in the whole game. They've leveled up once more, and then they jump through and fight the first boss. I will stress that they didn't save any leveling up to get to the first boss by buying that really good sword. You can still buy the middle range sword and beat the boss on the same level, but they will be doing a lot more damage to the boss with this better sword, so that's probably why they chose it. After beating the boss, they dip through and get the key to a chest, so this opens pretty much all the chests in the game, and it opens up the entire game. So what they're going to do now is actually leave that temple, go back to the mine, and get the better sword in the mine. On the way back to the mine, they take a detour past this guy who gives the power ring. That essentially just doubles your attack power whenever you have it equipped, so it's very worth having. In the later games of the E-series, the rings are on a timer, so you can only use them for a particular amount, although in this game they just last forever. Now that he's in the mine, we're not able to kill any of the enemies, so we're not actually at a high enough level there. Essentially what's going to happen is we're going to go through the mine and get the item that gives you the sword, so it's pretty risky this part of the game. You can see the strategy that they're using is a lot of saving and reloading, just because enemies can kill you in one hit and it can be pretty scary. Eventually they come across this treasure chest with the rotor seed. That's what you need to get the sword from those 2 big trees in the field, so that's exactly where they're going to go now. Go through this weird side quest where you talk to the trees, but then they get a really good sword for the rest of the game. Now you'll already see the beauty of the sword in action, so even though we're too lower level to kill these enemies normally, if we have that sword equipped we should be able to do quite a bit of damage. So you can see them getting a game over there, they're just going to be saving and reloading. These enemies are not easy to kill, but if you save and reload you're going to be able to just have another go at it there. So that sword saves a bit of grinding and a bit of leveling up really, pretty worth getting. After a little bit more grinding, we take a trip back to town and we grab a wing. The wing is pretty useful because it lets you warp straight back. We'll be doing the temple dungeon next, and it's pretty far away from town. We do need to return to town afterwards, so having that wing just makes everything quite a bit quicker. Eventually the run gets into this really good grinding spot where you're warping to and from a statue just to kill this enemy over and over. I'd recommend doing this with a very high powered sword and a pretty high level if you're going to do it, because if you have a low powered sword you have to do 3 or 4 hits and it is pretty hard to actually kill this enemy. But this is a pretty consistent grinding spot for the run, and that enemy is giving you about 100 experience points each time, which is pretty nice. With enough levels we beat the boss pretty quickly, and that's the temple done, so then I'll be warping back to town and doing the mine, which is the second area. To beat the boss from the mine, it requires you to be at maximum level, and this enemy is really good to grind off, because if you go in and out of the door, the enemy just reappears, and it's worth about 300 experience point each time you kill it. Pretty good way to grind. So here's the boss for the mine. You do need to be maximum level to beat this, and you just have to wait for the bats to sort of go to that one spot and then do a bit of damage to the enemy. You can usually get about 2 hits in at a time whenever it forms into the enemy there. We'll walk back to town and give the harmonica to this lady in the top right corner, and then that's everything we need to get into the final dungeon. At this point, most of the routing and strategy is all finished up in the speedrun, and it's all a matter of execution from this point, because the final dungeon, although it is fairly non-linear, is the same path every time no matter what you do. The whole section through the final tower is really impressive. We make heavy use of the timer ring once we have it to slow down enemies, but apart from that it's just being really precise and killing enemies as efficiently as possible. Usually they're right in your path and they move extremely quickly, so it's an extremely impressive part of the run that's happening right here. We have heavy use of saving and loading just in case of deaths, and the run makes pretty heavy use of the mirror item. So the mirror item freezes the enemies in place. For example here they're being a bit of a pain, so we use the mirror just out of the item selection there, and that lets you get through a bit more. Something like a Taz wouldn't really need to use the mirror, but it is pretty useful here. And the run makes it all the way through to the final boss. This is really impressive, this run, and an hour and 45 minutes is just crazy for this game. Usually when you're playing this game you're spending 3 or 4 hours just grinding before you can even start the run, let alone finishing the whole thing. So it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of the E series. It's an extremely impressive run. Now move on to talking about the Taz. There's not really a whole lot to say about the Taz that is different to RTA, so I'll keep this section pretty short. There's been a few different Tazs of this game, with the most recent being from 2015. The first Taz actually opened the menu before going into the shop, which was a slower setup than this Taz, which just moves down and up a little bit more. It's exactly the same setup as RTA, and I'll leave a link to the actual Taz in the description. Essentially it's the same as that demo that I showed you before, but just very speedy. A lot of the menus in this shop are frame perfect, so you can just zoom through them in the Taz setting. It's about 4 seconds faster than an RTA speedrun, this Taz. So in terms of no game and glitch Tazs, there is this glitchless one on Nico Video, which goes for about an hour and 21 minutes, and it's split up into 5 parts. It's got lots of commentary with subtitles, which are all in Japanese, but if you watch the run and you're familiar with the game, you'll figure out pretty much what's going on. Now, on the topic of glitchless Tazs, I was actually curious myself about what one would look like. I was aware of the Taz on Nico Video and wanted to see what my own route would come out like, and it ended up being about 2 minutes faster than the Nico Video Taz. That being said, this is quite a bit newer than the Nico Video Taz, so for its time it was still pretty impressive. So this does it in 1:19:47, which is about half an hour faster than RTA and about 2 minutes faster than that old Taz. I won't go too much into detail about this Taz because I actually have a full commentated version on the 8BitBeast YouTube channel, so I will link that in the description so that you can check that out if you're interested in the whole thing. The route is pretty similar to RTA, although the main part where it saves time is the starting grind. I actually only grabbed the middle sword rather than the best sword like RTA does, and that means that I need one less trip to town and I don't need to go and get the ruby in this temple. So I will be a little bit weaker through the start of the game, and that comes into play particularly with the first boss. So you need to be level 4 with either the middle sword or the best sword to deal any damage to the first boss, and when I get into this boss fight you'll see how little damage I'm actually doing. All that we need to do is deal a little bit of damage though, because at the end of the day we just need to get through the boss and then the whole game opens up after that. So you can see the tiny little slivers of damage that we're dealing. It's not very much, but it is enough to get through it. So that's really the main difference between this and the RTA run. I get to this boss quite a lot faster. It's probably about 5-10 minutes faster than the RTA run does it, but the RTA run does have a better sword at this point, so it is a bit of a trade-off. If you recall from the RTA run, one of the first things they do after beating this first boss is getting the key to open all the chests and then going and getting one of the best swords in the game. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. So although I don't have as good a sword, pretty soon we'll be lined up again because I'll have that 4th level sword, which is pretty powerful. Now, one other bit where the Taz saves time is just in general precision in fighting enemies and bosses and stuff. So when the RTA run did this boss, it was leveled up quite a bit more and it was able to kill the boss in like 2 or 3 hits, but the Taz takes many more hits to kill the boss. It is still worth it overall because grinding up before the boss is slower, but the Taz has to spend that bit more time in this section, and if you try to do this section RTA as weak as we are right now, you probably wouldn't make it through. The other thing about RTA versus Taz is the Taz doesn't need to do the in-game saving before rough enemies because it can just try to get through them, and if it doesn't work it'll try something else. For example, this hallway, which is usually pretty scary, we can just manipulate all the enemies to not really get in our way in a Taz setting. In RTA you'd have to do a lot of saving and ducking and weaving and probably killing the enemies in the end, but the Taz just makes it through pretty much without slowing down. So that's pretty much all I'll say about this Taz for now, because the rest of it feels pretty much the same as RTA, just slightly more optimal in terms of boss and enemy kills, although I would encourage you to check out my commentator Taz on the 8BitBiz YouTube channel, which will be linked in the description. And that kind of wraps up everything I want to say about Ys on the Master System. So it's a really great game, I'd suggest checking it out. If you want a fun speedrun, just do one of the 80% runs, which is like 20 seconds. You'll get on the leaderboard with a pretty nice time and it doesn't take too long to learn at all. Or if you just want a good casual experience, this game is really enjoyable, as is the rest of the series, so I'd highly recommend checking it out. Just be aware it is going to be pretty tricky, and you pretty much need to save and load as if you were using save states or something, and that is by design of the game. So that'll be all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please do consider subscribing to the channel and checking out some of the other videos that I have. I'm going to leave you with some fun effects of the mirror glitch.